Well, it's great to welcome you back as we are continuing our studies of the Greek of the New Testament. We have the end in sight, don't we? We're at chapter 29 now, and there's only 33 chapters in this book, so you're doing great. Congratulations on the progress you're making. This chapter 29 is really quite an important chapter because it introduces the fourth and fifth of the principal parts. You know, we've talked about these before. The reason they're called principal parts is because each of these represents a change in the verb stem before the particular grammatical construction is accomplished. So we have what's called the present system, the future system, the second of them. The third is the aorist system. We've skipped over the fourth and fifth, which of course are going to be coming up now in this chapter. And then we looked at the sixth of the principal parts, which is called the aorist passive. And what you've noticed along the way is that in each of these cases, there's a basic change that takes place in the stem. Now, sometimes the verb stem changes in a somewhat regular fashion. For example, when we change from the present to the future, we add a sigma to the end of the stem, so luo becomes luso, and so on. I think you followed that along the way. We're going to have the same kind of thing taking place now as we look at the perfect system and the perfect middle system, which by the way includes the perfect passive as well. So the perfect active and the perfect middle and passive are the fourth and fifth of the principal parts that come up at this point. And once again, we're going to find that we have a basic change in the verb stem. The change actually is essentially simply adding a kappa to the end of the stem. So we're going to find the characteristic kappa, which is a sign of the perfect system, attached to the end of the stem. You're also going to encounter what's called the reduplication, which means that in the ordinary course of events, if a verb began with a consonant, you would duplicate that consonant and put right before or right after it the letter epsilon. So for example, luo becomes leluka, you see. Lambda, epsilon, lambda, leluka. That duplication there of the consonant is actually called the reduplication, and the epsilon is inserted right in the middle. We'll see that as we go through the chapter. And then you notice, of course, that the kappa is added at the end. And then what we have essentially are endings from that point on that look pretty much like the endings that we used in the first aorist. And so in some ways, the endings we find here are not going to be overly surprising. The apparent simplicity of this is complicated somewhat because there are a fair number of verbs that form the changes in the stem somewhat irregularly. And so that's kind of the bad news in this chapter. And I guess what I want to say to you is while it's important to have the basic rules in mind as to how the stem is going to be changed, at the same time, don't bank on it too heavily. Really, the most important way to approach this, probably the smartest way to approach it, is to learn the most important, the most common of the verbs that show up and make sure you've mastered them. Learn the basic rules by which the verb stem is going to be altered, and I think gradually you'll get a feel for it. But this can be a somewhat complex chapter in the sense that some of these verb stems change in ways that are somewhat unexpected. We'll look a little bit more at that, of course, as we go along, and you'll see some examples of that in the exercises as well. All right, well, what is the perfect tense? There really isn't an appropriate counterpart to it in English. We, of course, in English have a perfect tense. It usually involves the word have. I could say I walk down the street today. I walked down the street yesterday. That would be the simple past tense. If I were to say to you, I have walked down the street before, that would be the English perfect, but that's not at all what's going on with the Greek perfect, so be careful not to confuse those two. The Greek perfect is a peculiar tense, and it's quite important that you understand it, and especially if you're involved in biblical teaching, you may want to incorporate this as you read the New Testament to explain the subtle tense of various New Testament texts. The force of the Greek perfect is simply this. It's referring to action that took place in the past but continues to have present effect. That's the main thing to know about it. Action that took place in the past, but it continues to have present effect. And really, in some ways, the force of the perfect tense is more the present than it is the past. It's implying something in the past, but it's really saying something about the present. That's the reason that the perfect tense is actually considered a primary tense, because it's referring to action or a state of affairs in the present, you see, but at least alluding to a past state, a past action that produced this present state of affairs. I think probably the most telling example of this, and the one that I've enjoyed using, I think in the years I've taught Greek, is the phrase that you'll often hear in the New Testament, "It is written." Jesus will sometimes use that expression, and you find it elsewhere, of course. It is written. Well, what does that mean? It means, first of all, that something was written in the past. You see, it's not being written today. It's not saying it is being written right now. The force of that statement is that something was written in the past but continues to have binding effect in the present. The present force is what's important. It is written, you see. It is written right now, but it's written based on something that took place in the past. It's not the same as saying it was written, which may or may not have present effect, but it actually is referring to something that actually binds us right now in the present. You might almost translate a phrase like that, something like, "It stands written," you see. It stands as good law right now in the case of this particular thing. Well, that's the force of the perfect. And so when you run into it, you want to be aware that it's referring to something in the past, but it has that present binding effect, or that present kind of status is being produced by that. The perfect tense has both an active voice and a middle and passive voice. Good news here, the middle and passive are identical, so you're not going to be learning 3 new sets of endings, but nevertheless you need to be aware that there is a separate set, of course, for each of those voices, the middle and passive as opposed to the present. And also, of course, we have the various applications of it, so you can have a perfect passive participle, or you can have a perfect passive indicative, you see, that sort of thing. So there are a few permutations that you're going to get a hold of here, but you'll find that really it's not quite as difficult as it may seem at first brush. So that's the basic heart of this matter. We're going to be, of course, going through the chapter as we typically do. I'll be taking a look at some of the vocabulary words where Machen actually provides for us examples of words where the verb stem changes somewhat irregularly, and that will help you on the way. We'll look at a little bit more at some of the applications of the perfect tense, and then, of course, we'll look at some of the exercises. So, with that in mind, let's go ahead and get started as we consider the perfect tense here in chapter 29. All right, well, let's take a look at these vocabulary words. The first one that we have here is the word akekoa. Akekoa. Well, notice here that it's from akuo. We probably would have guessed that. Notice some of the changes that take place, however, in the stem. First of all, the reduplication is not taking place. The alpha remains an alpha. Sometimes there will be a lengthening of that initial vowel, but in this case it doesn't take place. That's part of what makes this word irregular. We have the akuo becoming a k, and then of course akekoa. The alpha here is going to represent the first person singular, and so as we look at the rest of the endings, we'll find that they change according to the rules of the perfect system. But the real surprise in this one is simply the way in which the verb stem has been changed. Similarly, we have the word baptizo, baptizo, and the perfect of this is bebaptismai. Notice here we do have what I was talking about earlier, the reduplication. So this, at least, is somewhat predictable. We have the beta being reproduced again, followed by an epsilon, and that would be a typical example of a reduplication. When we look at the passive form of this, we find that the passive ending, mu alpha iota, is attached directly to the stem, which ends in a sigma instead of a kappa. And that's what makes this one irregular. There will be a couple of examples of that in the exercises as well, but that's the perfect passive indicative of baptizo. The next word we have here is gegona. It's the perfect indicative of genomai. This is a word that's commonly used to convey the notion of it came to pass, and so on when it's used in the perfect. Gegana is the word we'll see in the exercises that accomplishes that. Gegrapha and gegramai is the perfect active and perfect passive indicative of grapho. Again, you'll notice that there's a little bit of an irregularity here. We don't have a kappa, which ordinarily would be the sign of the perfect. The endings here are going to be the same as we would expect, and the endings here also will be what we expect, but the formation of the stem is a little bit unexpected. We do have the reduplication that's going on, so that part is predictable, but otherwise it is a little bit irregular. Genao is simply a contract verb. The first time we've had this one, it means I beget. Of course, it's common in the New Testament, speaking of various people being begotten, and so on. Ingidzo, the next word that we have here, is the word that means I come near. And we're going to see in the exercises that word is used in a variety of ways, and so we'll hang on to that. The next word we have is agagertai. Agagertai. This is the perfect passive indicative of agero. It's the third person singular. And so the passive sense is he was raised up. And you can see the peculiar sense of this is he was raised up and continues to be raised up. It's used, of course, especially in connection with Christ in the New Testament. And that's the chief importance of that word. And it's the reason that Machen mentions it separately here. Next word we have is egnoka. Egnoka. This is from gnosko. Notice once again, it's somewhat irregular. It does end with the kappa, alpha, which is predictable, but there is no reduplication at the beginning. And so that's why he's mentioned it here in the vocabulary list. Alelutha is the perfect indicative of erkamai. You know erkamai, of course. We learned that long ago. I come or I go. Here is the perfect indicative of this, which would be translated something on the order of I am come, you see. I have come and continue to be here might be the basic sense of it. The next word we have is erethane. Erethane. This is from Lego. Lego is quite irregular. I think you've probably figured that out by now. This is the aorist passive indicative, you see, of Lego. And so it's, again, irregular. This would be the sixth of the principal parts, but then we also have the aorist passive participle here, rethes, which we're going to be seeing in the exercises. And so this word is simply being expanded for you. You've already had, of course, Lego earlier. This is simply adding to some of your repertoire with respect to that word. Heoraka. Heoraka from blepo, or also from harao, means I see. This would be the perfect active indicative. I am seen, you might say. That is the idea that there's an act of seeing that started in the past and continues in the present. This is used, for example, in the book of 1 John. You may recall there John begins by saying, that which we have seen, that which we have heard. In both cases there, he's using a form of the word heoraka, and it means we saw it and in some sense continue to see it, or at least continue to be affected by what we saw. And so that would be one of those cases where it's very difficult to translate the significance of the perfect, but it certainly gives insight into the force of the text. Thnesko, I die, is used only in the perfect, and the perfect form of this is tethneka, and it would be I am dead. I died in the past and continue to be dead, usually used metaphorically in the New Testament, of course, in the sense of being dead to sin, that sort of thing. You could probably identify texts where that particular usage is found. Martyreo, I bear witness. We've had the word martyr and martyria, so there's no surprises there. Petros, the name for Peter in the New Testament, and of course you're familiar with that. This is a word that derives from a Greek word that means a rock, and so it's connected to that. And then finally, pleroo, I fulfill. And so this is a verb that, contract verb, as you can see, that is used in various ways in the New Testament, but usually in connection, of course, with fulfilling of prophecy, that sort of thing. All right, well, let's take a look now at the perfect active indicative endings of luo. Luo is a regular verb, so we first of all notice here that we have, as I was saying to you earlier, the reduplication. We take the lambda, we duplicate it and put an epsilon after it. So this would be the standard way in which the perfect is formed, but as you're probably detecting, there are an awful lot of exceptions to that rule. Secondly, we regularly add a kappa at the end of the stem, and that becomes the sign of the perfect. And then the endings themselves are actually very much the same as what we learned with the aorist. So we have leluka, lelukas, leluke, lelukamen, lelukete, lelukasi, or commonly you'll find lelukan. And so that is pretty much predictable, you see. If you learn the aorist, then you're not going to have any trouble keeping this in mind. The perfect active infinitive is going to be lelukenai, lelukenai, which again is using the perfect ending here, but is somewhat similar to what we learned with the infinitive. All right, turning our attention now to page 184, Machen notes for us the perfect active participle of luo is lelukos, lelukia, lelukos. We'll look at these in detail down at the bottom of the page, but he's simply providing it here so he can complete his description of the perfect active. So he also concludes this then in 429 by saying these forms constitute the perfect system, which is the fourth of the principal parts, and it's based on leluka. He notes here you add the kappa, and he also talks about reduplication. We've already discussed that. He mentions here that the perfect is a primary tense. I've already told you in earlier discussions that primary tenses usually refer to present and future time, whereas as a rule, secondary tenses refer to past time. And so he's noting here that the perfect is a primary tense, and that's quite an important thing to bear in mind. The perfect is a primary tense, meaning its emphasis is largely on the present, but it is alluding to action in the past that has affected the present. But it is a primary tense. Nevertheless, as he notes here, it uses endings that come from the aorist, which is actually a secondary tense. So it's a bit of a hybrid, but it makes it a little bit easier to learn these endings, I think. He notes that the perfect active subjunctive is quite rare, and so we're not going to bother looking at that, but we do want to take a look now at the perfect active participle. So lelukos, lelukia, lelukos, lelukotos, lelukios, lelukotos, lelukoti, lelukia, lelukoti, lelukota, lelukion, lelukos. Notice that it's quite similar to the endings that you've already learned with the participle in the chapter on participles. These are the present participle endings with minor modifications. We don't have, of course, the new, so it's not ontos as we found earlier, but otos, but otherwise pretty similar. We come down to the plural side, lelukotes, lelukiai, lelukota, lelukoton, lelukion, lelukoton, lelukosi, lelukiais, lelukosi, and lelukotas, lelukios, lelukota. So again, you'll notice that the endings, while they're not quite the same as we learned back in the present participle chapter 18, nevertheless they're similar enough that it's not overly difficult to master these endings. All right, looking at page 185, I'm not going to go through this in detail. I just want you to pay attention to it. Essentially what he's noting here is that various verbs and various types of verbs form the perfect stem in a variety of ways. So for example, he says if the verb stem begins with a vowel or a diphthong, then the reduplication consists in lengthening that vowel. That is somewhat like the augment that we saw earlier. The word elpidzo, I hope, becomes eilpika, you see. I have hoped, or I am continuing to hope based on past action. Aiteo becomes eiteka, you see. So that's illustrating that point, and that often is the case, but not always. It's not a firm rule, but it is a general rule that will apply in many cases. If the verb stem begins with two consonants, the reduplication may, but by no means always, consists in prefixing the epsilon like an augment before. So egnoka, you see that we saw earlier, is the perfect of gnosko. Doesn't always apply, as he illustrates here. Verb stems beginning with phi, theta, or chi are reduplicated with pi, tau, or kappa, respectively. And he gives some illustrations of that. And finally, verb stems that end with a vowel are lengthened. This is the very same thing we saw with contract verbs in forming the future and the aorist. You'll lengthen that contract or that vowel that would otherwise be contracted and then add the kappa at the end. And so, for example, tefilleka is from phileo. The epsilon there is lengthened to an eta, just as we did in the perfect system. He notes as well that if the verb stem ends with tau, delta, or theta, those letters are typically dropped and the kappa is simply added directly to the stem. So elpika from elpidzo, you see the zeta was dropped there and we simply insert the kappa. I know this seems like a thousand little details, and in some ways I think it may make as much sense to simply memorize the most common verbs as they come up. You'll find that you start getting a feel for this after a while, but at least these are the general rules that apply when it comes to forming the stem that's associated with the perfect system. All right, coming to page 186, we'll notice that the perfect middle and passive indicative are provided by Machen here. Lelumai, lelusai, lelutai, lelumatha, lelustha, leluntai. So here again we find these endings, which are somewhat similar to endings that we've seen in the past, but again they're modified slightly as we find in the perfect. He says the perfect middle and passive infinitive of luo is lelusthai, again somewhat similar to the infinitives as we already studied them. The perfect middle and passive participle is lelumenos, lelumene, lelumenon. Note the irregular accent there. And notice also that these endings now are exactly the same as we had when we were studying the present middle participle. The endings are the same and they are declined the same. So again, you're not learning new endings here. They are attached directly to the stem. There is an irregular accent, but otherwise they are the same as what you've already learned. So the trick here is simply to be aware that we're going to have the perfect stem, and then attached to them will be these middle endings that we learned back with participles. And so this is really not too difficult in terms of formulating these words, but it does require that you review and make sure you have in mind the endings that we learned back there with participles. The forms given above, he says, constitute the perfect middle system, which, by the way, includes the perfect passive system, and that's the fifth of the principal parts. And so, if you're counting accurately, that does cover all of the principal parts of the Greek language, 1 through 6, and rounds out our discussion then of the Greek verb in that sense. He notes the reduplication in the middle and passive is the same as in the active. And he also notes here that the primary middle endings are directly added to the stem without any intervening vowel. They're simply attached to the stem in the way that we saw earlier in the indicative. There may be some changes that take place with participles, but nevertheless, that's the basic rule that we'll find applying here. And moving to page 187, he notes that if the verb stem ends with a vowel, that vowel is regularly lengthened. We talked about that before. This is the same as you saw with contract verbs in the case of the future and the aorist. If the verb stem ends with a consonant, various changes take place, which are usually best learned by observation. This can be somewhat irregular, but for example, he gives you the example here, gegramai. The third person singular is gegraptai. You see, well, the change there, adding the pi, is not something you would necessarily predict. It is irregular, and it's one of those things where, at least with the common verbs in the New Testament, it's probably going to be as efficient simply to try to learn those as you encounter them and you'll find that you do begin to have a feel for it after a while. The pluperfect is skipped over by Machen, and I'm going to skip over it as well. It's quite rare in the New Testament, and if you continue your studies of Greek, you'll come across it at some point or other, but for our purposes now, we won't bother with it. He begins a discussion at this point of the use of the perfect tense, and I'm not going to go through this. I did give you some description of this already in our opening conversation. I do strongly recommend that you read this section of Machen and listen to my comments about it, and I think you'll get a feel for it pretty readily. It's not too difficult, but the important thing to keep in mind is that really there's no convenient way in many cases to translate, especially the perfect active, into English. We do have some neat ways of handling the perfect passive, as he notes along the way. Something like, it is written, you see, that sort of thing. I am come, or even something like the beloved disciple, you see, the disciple who is beloved. He's beloved in the past and continues to be so. That is in English actually a participle, but it represents a good example of the application of the perfect, that sort of thing. The exercises will bring these out as well, but Machen's description is worth reading over a couple of times and making sure you have a pretty good sense of it. All right, so are you ready to take a look at some exercises? Let's turn our attention to page 189 and paragraph 454, which is the translation exercises. The first one we have here is oudeis estin dikaios kata ton nomon eme ho poiesos panta ta gegramena in to biblio tu namu. Oudeis, we know, is the word that means no one or nothing. This is personal. It's first person, masculine, so we're going to say no one. Estin is the third person singular of is, enclitic, and so of course we don't turn this accent that we have here into a grav, just reminding you of that. Oudeis estin, no one is. Dikaios, righteous, no one is righteous. Kata, ton, nomon. Kata, of course, with the accusative, means according to. So no one is righteous according to the law. Eme, you know, literally means if not, or it can mean except or unless. You have to let the context sort of lead you here. I'm going to use the word except here. That's clearly what's in mind. So no one is righteous according to the law, except, and then the aorist participle of poieo, he who does, and then panta, ta, gegramena, all the written, you see, and there's the perfect now, it's the perfect passive, so all the written in the book of the law things. The things, you might put it, that stand written, the things that are written, the things that have been written in the past but continue to have present effect. And so that would be a good example of how the perfect is applied here. It's perfect passive because these are the things that have been written, you see, but they continue to have that binding force today. So no one is righteous according to the law except he who does all the things written in the book of the law. All the things that stand written in the book of the law is the force of that. All right, our second example, euangelisato pantaton laon legon hoti engeken he basileia ton urinon. All right, so euangelisato, this of course is from euangelizomai. It's a deponent verb, so we have the aorist third person singular here. He preached the gospel would be the idea, but of course the idiomatic application of this in Greek is that he gospeled someone, and so it takes the accusative. We would say quite literally, he gospeled all the people, in the accusative case there, but of course we won't translate it that way because that would be a little awkward in English, so we'll say he preached the gospel to all the people. Legon, present participle, first person singular, masculine. He preached to all the people, saying, hoti. Now we have engedzo, this word that we had in the vocabulary list. But of course you'll recognize here that what we have is the perfect active of this third person singular, engeken, and so preaching that it came near, and that would be the perfect. In other words, it has come near. It is near, and it came near and remains near would be the force of it. It has come near. He basileia ton urinon, the kingdom of heaven. So he gospeled the people, or preached the gospel to all the people, saying that the kingdom of heaven has come near. And the perfect of that is going to be that it has come in the past and continues to be present right now with us in the present sense. And the third example we'll look at here, ho heorakamen kai akekoamen legamen kai humen hina kai humes pistuseta eis ton Christon. So notice we have now two verbs that are both in the perfect. We add both of these in our vocabulary. Heorakamen, the perfect of blepo, to see. Akekoamen, the perfect of akuo. And so both of these are perfect active, but they both, of course, are indicating something that took place in the past and continue to have present effect today. That which we have seen and have heard. That would be one way to translate it, and maybe the best way, but of course it doesn't quite convey the force of the Greek. The Greek is saying that which we have seen and in some sense continue to see or feel the effects of that which we saw, and similarly with that which we have heard and continue to hear, or at least continue to feel the effects of what we have heard. That's the force of the perfect, and that needs to be brought out as you're teaching the New Testament. You come across this particular use of the perfect, then you want to bring that out in your instructions on it. That which we have seen and heard, we say also to you. Legamen, of course, we've had that many times. Also to you. Hina, in order that, takes the subjunctive. Kai humes, probably even you, emphasis there, even you. Pistuseta, here's the subjunctive we were expecting, second person plural, aorist subjunctive, so even you might believe eis ton Christon, in Christ. So that which we have seen and heard we say also to you, in order that even you might believe in Christ. All right, well, let's turn our attention now to the composition exercises. These are on page 190, and we'll be translating now from English into Greek. The first of these that Machen provides is, where is the priest? He is already come. Of course, we're going to assume that Machen wants us to use the perfect tense here whenever we have an excuse to, so we'll try to keep that in mind. Where is the priest? Well, we start off with this interrogative pronoun, where. Pu takes, of course, the circumflex. Pu esten. Enclitic, two-syllable enclitic does not take an accent when it follows a word with a circumflex on the ultima. So where, pu esten, is predicate nominative, ho hierus. We've had this vocabulary word earlier, of course, and as I say, it takes the nominative. Where is the priest? Here's the Greek question mark. And then ede, adverb, already. And here's the perfect now, elelutha. He is come. You see, he has come and continues to be here would be the force of that. Where is the priest? Already he is come, or he has come and continues to be here. All right, let's look at the second of these. It reads, all the baptized disciples are in the small city. So we have all, pantes, the, hoi, all the. Now what are we going to do with this word baptized? Well, this would be a good example of where the passive participle in English is best conveyed by the perfect participle in Greek. It is passive, of course, the baptized disciples, and it is indicating that they were baptized in the past and continued to be in a state of being baptized people, you see, which would be the common New Testament view of the subject. And so we're going to use the perfect passive participle. We're going to use the nominative, plural, masculine because it's going to go with disciples, which is masculine. We're going to take the ending here, which was, you recall, the middle or passive participle ending, and attach it directly to the stem that is used in the perfect middle and passive. We have the reduplication here, so be, baptis, and then we add the ending directly to the stem, so it's be baptismenoi. Notice the irregular accent that applies in the case of middle and passive participles. So all the baptized, mathetai, disciples, asin, enclitic, no accent on it because we have put an accent on the ultima here, are in te mekra, in the small pole, city. So all the baptized disciples are in the small city. And number 3, the last of these that we'll consider, reads from Machen. The priests, having been baptized, came together into the same house. Now notice, I think what Machen wants to do is try to highlight in your mind the difference between a simple past participle, you see, aorist participle, and the perfect participle. We had all the baptized disciples in the previous example. This is more just a standard aorist participle. The priests, having been baptized, came together into the same house. So in this case, I'm simply going to use the participle, the aorist participle, passive form, of course. So hoi, hieres, the priests, nominative, plural, having been baptized. Now we have the standard aorist passive stem with the sign of the aorist passive, the theta, and of course the ending here, which is nominative plural, to agree with the priests. So the priests, having been baptized, from sunerkamai, we have sunealphon, they came together, ace, tone, auton, into the same oikon house. Well, hopefully that'll get you going as you continue your studies of this particular chapter. As I say, this chapter, chapter 29, is quite important because the perfect tense, which is used quite commonly in the New Testament, really doesn't have a clear-cut corollary, a sort of counterpart in the English language, and for that reason alone, it's worth really mastering it. It will give you a richer understanding of some of the subtleties, the nuances of the New Testament as you're reading along, and certainly will help you as you're attempting to explain the sense of the text to others that may be relying on your teaching skills. I hope this has gotten you going. Continue your labors by working through the exercises. The answer key, I believe, is correct throughout, so go ahead and test your work against the answer key. And once you're comfortable with this chapter, then come on back and we'll move along to chapter 30. Until then, God's richest blessing on your studies of the Greek language. We'll see you next time.